crypt, cold and dark, they celebrated. The candles were blowing, and they paused every time they heard a foreign sound, because they were afraid. This might quite possibly be their last Mass, their last celebration. First Christians. They risked everything. Some of them would even die. For what? To celebrate what? To celebrate the Eucharist. Some of them might even die to celebrate the Eucharist. And what about us? What would we do? What would we sacrifice? Would we be willing to give our lives for the possibility of being caught or maybe executed to celebrate the Eucharist? Would we be willing to get up from our beds? Would we be able to desert the soccer field or the television or all these other things that are nice distractions within life, diversions? But would we be able to leave them in order to celebrate the Eucharist? Something that many would go on to die for. Last week we were talking a little bit about how we need the magisterium and the tradition in the Scriptures. And in talking about the Scriptures, I mentioned that section from John chapter 6. Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life within you. And so tonight I want to talk about two of our sacraments in the Church. But in dealing with those top 10 reasons why Catholics leave or non-Catholics will never join the Church, I'd like to focus tonight on misunderstandings of our doctrine and dogma concerning the Eucharist and concerning confession. But also one of the other reasons, anger about the morality within the Church, the moral standing in the Church. And what kind of piggybacks on that is people who feel as though the Church has abandoned them. So all these different issues I hope to touch on by talking about the Eucharist and confession. What is Moses saying to God? Lord, what do you want me to do with this stiff-necked people? I mean, I'm trying to lead them, I'm trying to do this and that, and they are Meribah and Massah. They are contention and fighting. That they're struggling to do what they want to do, and yet they're seeking water. Just like this lady. Can you imagine in the Gospel? So here's this Samaritan woman going out to the well. She's harassed every day, I'm sure, by these people at the well. Just like way back when Rebecca was harassed, and the ones before her. And so here she is at the well, she's doing her work. Jesus comes up and he says, hey, how about some of that water? And you can imagine her saying, you talking to me? In her nice New Jersey kind of, excuse me? You talking to me? You want water from me? You know, who are you? In other words, first of all, he was going against the law by talking to a woman he was not married to in public, let alone asking her for a drink. And they get into this whole dialogue. And what we come to discover through that Gospel, and I truncated it quite a bit, we did the shortened version. If you read the whole lengthy version, she is searching for something. She's been floundering for so long, and she's searching for something. And Jesus pretty much says straight up, I don't know who you heard about this religion from, but you don't understand what you believe. You're talking about all this stuff, you don't even know what you're saying. And he goes on to begin to teach her. Part of the point of catechesis is we've heard these things for so many years, but we might not understand the why. And so one of the questions that comes up with the Eucharist, when we talk about unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, this is not a symbol. Remember, many of his disciples left him over this. They didn't leave him over anything else. They left him over this. He goes from 72 that he sent out 2 by 2 to 12. It's a pretty big reduction here. And he lost all these people who were with him for 3 years, and now all of a sudden they walk away because this is a symbol? I don't think so. And so the Eucharist is Christ. We believe it is Christ. We believe what the Catholic Church preaches and teaches as a sacred deposit of faith. The problem occurs sometimes when we have a wedding or a funeral, when we have some kind of ecumenical service, that non-Catholic Christians want to go to communion. And they can't understand why it is not permitted. And we have to be careful here as Catholics, because as Catholics, you will go to their weddings and their funerals as well, and many of them will invite you to communion. You can't do that, because you are Catholic. And what we believe that communion is the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. It is not a symbol. And so if we go to another church and we receive that as Catholics, we are assenting to their beliefs, or really dissenting to their beliefs. We're compromising ourselves. In the same way, if they come into the church and they think that it's only a symbol, or they don't believe everything the Catholic Church teaches as dogma and doctrine, then they cannot receive communion. Why? Because they are not in communion. It's really a lie. To come up and say, well, everyone else is going to receive, I'm going to take the bread, that's the first sign. If they are not in communion with our teachings, then how can they represent themselves as being in communion? It's like giving something to someone who will never appreciate it. You're not going to do that. I'm not going to give my UK hat away to a duke. There's no way. Because they probably stomp on it or tear it up or something else. That, we're not going to invite someone. We have this symphony orchestra playing in front of the president or high officials. We're not going to invite the guy to just come up and play his instrument. He was never at any of the rehearsals. He never went through the sacrifices. And yet he wants to be a part of that. There's a story of a kid on a ship with his family. They sold everything they had so that they could get a ticket on this ship to come to the States. And so they're on this ship and they only had a nickel left. They're starving to death. They're eating soup, which is pretty much water flavored with onions. And so the father gives his son this nickel and he says, now you go. Be a man now. You go and find us some food. Don't waste this. It's the whole Jack and the Beanstalk thing. Don't you lose this, don't you waste it. So the son goes away and he's away for a while. And nobody can find him. And now the dad's getting worried that he got robbed or something else happened. So the dad starts to walk around the ship. Well, he goes into this big banquet room and he sees this table laden with food. And there's his son stuffing his face. And the first thought is, oh my gosh, how are we going to pay for this? They're going to put us in irons or something. And so he says to his son, son, what are you doing? I gave you the last nickel, and now you're going to get us arrested, you're going to get us in trouble. And the son said, this food is included in the price of the ticket. The food was free. It was there all along, but they never took advantage of it. But you have to buy a ticket to get the food. You got to give up what you have. You have to invest yourself in it in order to get the food that nourishes us forever. And so the reason why non-Catholic Christians cannot receive the Eucharist is they haven't paid the price of the ticket. They still believe in whatever church they're a part of. They haven't adopted the Catholic faith and invested themselves in it. And therefore, we're not going to give our most precious treasure to someone who cannot appreciate it. We read in Paul's letter to the Corinthians, whoever therefore eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of profaning the body and blood of the Lord. Let a man therefore examine himself, and so eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For anyone who eats and drinks without discerning the body eats and drinks judgment upon himself. The word is krisis in Greek. In Latin, it's damnatio. I don't think I have to translate that for you. It's very serious. Justin Martyr, who was one of the early saints and fathers of the church, wrote this, and he wrote this to Caesar, actually, Marcus Aurelius. He's arguing back and forth, and he says, "This food is called among us Eucharistia, the Eucharist, of which no one is allowed to partake, but the man who believes that the things which we teach are true, and who has been washed with the washing that is for the remission of sins and unto regeneration, and who is so living as Christ has enjoined." There are a few things here. First of all, they have to be baptized. They have to be washed. You can't have pagans just coming up to join in because they know some of the Catholics. Not only do you have to be baptized, but you have to discern and believe that this is what we say it is. It is the body and blood of Christ. I'm not saying it's not a difficult saying. The apostles were right. We have to work toward that faith. We got to, try to believe it. But then he goes on to say, "And who is living as Christ has enjoined." Living according to the laws of Christ, which means that even some Catholics will not be able to receive the Eucharist. Why? Because they are not in communion with us. They are ex-communio. They are outside of the community of faith. They're outside the sacraments. Well, how does one get outside of the sacraments? By living a lifestyle that is not acceptable to Christ. Now, we're all sinners, let's face it. I'll be the first to admit it. Okay? But to live in a perpetual state of sin. In other words, that means we can never get out of sin. We're living in it. We can't get out of it. And therefore, we cannot get out of it. We cannot worthily receive the Eucharist. Think about this for a minute. We believe that the Eucharist is Jesus. Now, if we're going to invite someone important into our house, we're going to clean up a little bit. I hope. We're going to clean up the house so it's presentable when this very important guest comes in. When we receive someone important into our house, this is the domus, okay? When we receive someone important into our house, we've got to make sure the house is clean. We have to make sure the house is pure. This is our soul. And so if we are inviting Jesus into us, which we do in the Eucharist, we have to make sure the house is presentable, that the house is clean. And how do we do this? We do this by living the life that Jesus wants us to live. But what if we can't? Because we're sinners. We make mistakes. Then we have the sacrament of reconciliation.